Thanks for coming, everyone. So as you all probably know, ransomware is a global business that's grown in scale and sophistication in recent years. Ransomware attacks involve criminal actors infiltrating a victim's computer, network or device, and then locking or encrypting their data or making their system non-functional before demanding that the victim pays a ransom to have that data or system be restored. So the methods used by ransomware attackers and the vulnerabilities that they target have continually evolved. So for example, the increased accessibility of ransomware as a service and ransomware toolkits and the prevalence of double extortion, which is where attackers first extort the ransomware victims by disrupting their systems and then with the threat of releasing or selling on their data. While significant attention's been given to ransomware attacks against companies that have been the target of mass data breaches, as well as critical services and infrastructure, ransomware can also impact individual computer users. So in our 2023 Australian Cybercrime Survey, we found that 2.4% of respondents had experienced pure ransomware victimisation in the 12 months prior to the survey, while a further 2.4% experienced data theft and extortion, but did not report that their device or system had been disrupted or compromised. So when comparing our survey data from 2023 to 2024, we found that ransomware prevalence has not changed across the 2 years, indicating that ransomware continues to be a major concern. Small to medium business owners are particularly at risk. So compared to other individuals, our research has shown that they're more likely to be targeted by ransomware and also more likely to pay the ransom. In addition to understanding how victims are targeted, we must also understand victim decision-making during the ransomware attack. So whether a victim decides to pay the ransom or not, ultimately is what fuels the business model. Many factors can influence this decision, including whether the victim has backups, insurance, and the ability to pay. Research into ransomware has increased in the past decade, yet little attention in Australia has been paid to the real experiences of victims and small business owners involved in these attacks. So we need research to inform efforts to assist victims during an attack and reduce the viability of the ransomware business model. So we aim to address this gap by using quantitative and qualitative data from a sample of ransomware victims who participated in the 2023 Australian Cybercrime Survey, to understand how ransomware attacks against individuals and small businesses occur, including how victims respond to an attack during and after, and the consequences of these attacks. So the Australian Cybercrime Survey is an annual survey of at least 10,000 people aged 18 years and older in Australia, which we draw from our online research panel. We have a quota-based sampling to reflect the characteristics of the Australian population. And we're interested in individual computer users, say, rather than companies, but our sample does include small to medium business owners and employees. We have a core survey which consistently measures victimisation, help-seeking and harms across multiple years, and then multiple addenda, which are short surveys completed by a subset of respondents which focus on specific topics. So the sample from this study, as I mentioned, was drawn from the 2023 Australian Cybercrime Survey. Questions about ransomware victimisation were included in our section on malware. So 331 respondents indicated that either the systems, devices or files had a virus or were inaccessible, so they were locked or unreadable, or their devices, servers or networks were disrupted, so they slowed down, lost connection or had outages, and they received instructions for paying a ransom to restore functionality. This sample doesn't include individuals who experienced data theft and extortion, but didn't report that device or system was disrupted or locked. So respondents were then asked whether they'd be willing to undertake follow-up online interviews to better understand their experiences of ransomware victimisation. This involved a moderator posing questions and prompts to respondents who submitted their written answers online. Interviews were undertaken with 33 participants. So this presentation includes data from the 331 participants who completed the ransomware questionnaire and the 33 participants who engaged in qualitative interviews. All right, so we asked victims about the events leading up to the ransomware attack. Third-party data breaches were common. So over half the sample experienced a third-party data breach in the 12 months prior to the survey, which is higher than the prevalence across the general Australian cybercrime survey, for whom 34% experienced a data breach. More than half of the ransomware victims have been contacted multiple times in the previous 12 months with threats and demands for payment. And this was significantly more common for small to medium business owners, with nearly 2/3 being contacted more than once and more than 1/3 being contacted 3 or more times. Importantly, over 40% of small to medium business owners had paid in response to one of these previous messages, a significantly higher proportion than other victims. Many ransomware victims couldn't remember clicking on suspicious links or pop-ups or files prior to their device being impacted, although this is significantly more common among small to medium business owners. So this speaks to the difficulty of spotting sort of malicious elements in websites, emails, social media posts, and the victim might not feel the impacts until days or weeks later. So the devices impacted most often were laptop computers, smartphones, and desktop computers. However, small to medium business owners were significantly more likely to experience impacts on their smart wearables, so like smartwatches, that kind of thing, and their security alarms and entry intercom systems. And so this later one poses clear risks to the physical security of their businesses. Business owners also experienced far-reaching impacts on their devices, so they had a higher number of devices being affected and a greater range of devices being impacted. Small to medium business owners were also more likely to report that the impacted devices had been issued to them from their workplace, or it was a personal device that they used for work, and they were also more likely to report that the ransomware had spread to workplace devices, systems, or email accounts. In addition to these impacts, nearly 1/3 of victims were threatened that their stolen data would be sold or shared on if they didn't make the ransom payment. This was similar for both small to medium business owners and other victims. So the amounts demanded of small to medium business owners were relatively low. 59% were asked to pay less than $500. And a small proportion were demanded to pay large sums of $15,000 or more, so around 14%. The amounts demanded of victims who were not small to medium business owners varied greatly, so 81% of ransoms fell between $100 and just under $10,000. In our qualitative interviews, we asked victims, we found that the victims take a range of factors into consideration when they first receive a ransom message, which determines whether they believe the threats to be genuine and serious. So most importantly, victims looked for evidence of impacts on their systems, devices, and files. Many victims quickly identified that their files had been altered or encrypted, their personal information had been accessed, malware had been installed on their device, or their device was being remotely controlled by someone else. So as one victim said, all data files in the PC and attached drives appeared to have been encrypted and their file type changed. Additionally, I found an identical text message in every folder advising of the encryption and providing an email address should I wish to have all the data unencrypted. So participants described feeling panic and anger and fear in response to seeing these impacts. There were several features of the ransom message designed to make the victim take the threat seriously and experience sort of urgency and fear. They often limited the available time in which to make a payment and had sort of threatening language and imagery. So my immediate response was a rush of panic. It was such a nightmare. I remember the messages vividly. It popped up on my screen in a big red font like something out of a hacker movie. The message came through as a creepy pop-up window accompanied by a scary-looking skull icon. So messages often warn victims to not go to authorities or seek outside assistance. So they were trying to attempt to make the victim feel isolated and prevent them from looking into other responses they could take to the attack. So they demanded payment in Bitcoin, I forget the quantity, be made within 7 days and provided a wallet ID. It did warn me not to contact authorities. So we found that the inclusion of victim personal information was another tactic attackers used to convince victims that their systems and information had been compromised and increase the sort of perceived severity of the threat. Attackers cited victims' names, emails, and current or former passwords to various accounts. So as one victim said, the perpetrator spelled out a password of mine in the email text, so it was obvious that my personal information had been compromised. Immediately I panicked. I thought, gee, what are they going to do? For a split second, I even considered if I should pay the ransom. However, some victims stated that the ransom message referred to outdated personal information, like old passwords, and it was possible that the actors were pretending to have obtained this data through compromising the victim's system, but in reality had gained old data somewhere else online, such as through a third-party data breach. So the perpetrator somehow had some of my old data, including old passwords. But they did not have much more than that. So victims who assessed the incident as genuine and serious then sort of took different actions to mitigate this. Some victims were able to restore the stolen data and wipe the malware from their systems. Most were unable to restore all of their files, but they were able to sort of minimise the damage to an acceptable extent. This meant that they didn't have to consider paying the ransom, and the only sort of cost was the time and effort it took to resolve the situation. So we found that these victims often had proactive cybersecurity practices before the attack. Many of them mentioned having automatic backups and engaged in security measures after the incident, such as resetting passwords and using virus scanners. Some of these victims had expertise in IT security, workplace advice for handling cybercrime incidents, or they found information online. So one victim said, the data was fully recovered, largely through the use of a pre-prepared written procedure for recovery, courtesy of the company that I work for. I believe that I'll be able to fully recover all important information without having to consider paying a ransom. So despite the attacker's warnings against victims seeking help for the ransomware attack, most victims did seek advice and support from someone, a person or an organisation that they knew. So this was usually friends, work colleagues or family, often who worked in the IT industry, or the victim believed that they were sort of tech savvy. So they provided advice on IT solutions and encouraged the victim to make formal reports to government agencies, police agencies or IT departments. So I contacted my 2 adult sons, both of whom worked in the computer industry. They knew exactly what had happened, told me not to respond to the emails, and came and re-imaged my computer. Put a new password on the router and recovered most of my files from a backup. So some victims talked about reporting to formal sources, such as the police or ScamWatch. One victim spoke about choosing to seek formal law enforcement advice despite warnings from the attacker to not get outside help, because they wanted to create a formal record of the incident in case an investigation would commence. So during the attack, seeking support and assistance was a complex decision. I was torn between the urgency of the situation and the warnings in the ransom message against involving authorities or anyone else. While the attackers warned against involving authorities, it was crucial to have a paper trail, an official record of the attack. So some victims, oh, no, is that right? Sorry. Yes, that's right, thank you. Some victims didn't seek assistance or advice because they felt responsible, they didn't know who could help, they believed the incident wasn't serious enough, or they believed that the offenders couldn't be caught. So I don't really feel that the police would really take any action. I felt that this is something that could be very difficult because the internet is so broad and hard to regulate, like if it was something from overseas. I didn't go to anyone else at the time. I felt this was my fault for being silly enough to click on a link like that. So only a few victims communicated with the attackers during this sort of incident in an attempt to understand the situation or negotiate a reduced payment. Most victims simply didn't trust the attackers, so I chose not to reply or attempt any kind of negotiation. I didn't want to give them any more information or leverage than they already had. So for one victim who did contact the offenders, the attackers offered to unencrypt one file as proof that they could unencrypt all of the files upon payment, and also offered to reduce the payment amount. So this kind of negotiating is a common bargaining tactic during ransomware attacks. So I contacted the attacker and we exchanged several emails where we discussed a possible payment and a possible reduction of the initial demand made. I was also advised that I could have one non-essential file unencrypted as proof that my files could all be unencrypted should I agree to pay. So this victim was unconvinced that the cyber criminals could be trusted, and they deemed that the negotiated amount was still too high given the risk that they wouldn't get their data back. So in our quantitative ransomware addendum, victims were asked whether they had paid or attempted to pay the ransom in the most recent incident. Overall, relatively few victims indicated they had actually paid the ransom, so around 12%. However, small and medium business owners were much more likely to have paid the ransom. So in our previous research, we found that the decision to pay was often related to the advice that was given to victims at the time. And this aligns with our qualitative data from the interviews where victims very often sought help and advice from people they knew on how to respond to an attack. In our qualitative interviews, all victims except one didn't pay the ransom in the end. Victims identified possible negative effects of paying and ultimately decided that the downsides outweighed the possible benefits. Victims often acknowledged that paying the ransom would not guarantee their systems would be restored, and they expressed distrust that the criminals would sort of keep their end of the deal. So I'd read enough about ransomware attacks to know that paying the ransom doesn't guarantee the safe return of your data. There are countless cases where victims have paid up but didn't get their files decrypted or had their data exposed anyway. So they also knew that paying could actually increase their chances of being targeted again, either by demonstrating their willingness to pay or by exposing financial information through the payment process. If I paid them, I'd be a target for other attackers, since I assumed they will post my details on the dark web and get other hackers to try and target me, as I'll have a history of paying. Hence, I decided that I would not pay anything. Some victims refused to pay the ransomware attackers out of principle and spoke about their desire to not fuel the ransomware business model, thereby potentially harming other victims in the process. So these participants were often angry and they didn't want to give the criminals the satisfaction of having a successful attack. So I was well aware that paying a ransom would only encourage and finance the criminals behind the attack. It would contribute to the perpetuation of these cybercrimes, potentially harming other victims in the process. Ethically, I couldn't justify supporting such criminal activities. Last one. A few victims spoke about the circumstances in which they would have paid, although ultimately one only made the payment. One victim stated they would have made the payment had they been in a financial position to do so. This victim was socially isolated. They spoke about being fearful of the offenders and that they felt they had no way to resolve the situation. Honestly, I think if I had the money, I would have paid. The experience was so scary and frightening that money didn't seem to matter much. The one victim that did pay was very distressed about the incident and indicated that work-related files had been locked and money had been stolen. So I'm shocked for the first time, all my money is gone. I didn't understand what's going on around me. I lost a lot of information and legal stuff, and I need to retrieve it back. I paid the ransom, I did not negotiate it. Cool. All right, so just to summarise, so we found that third-party data breaches were common among ransomware victims, and personal information was used to convince victims of the severity of the breach. This is consistent with our previous research showing that third-party data breaches significantly increase the likelihood of ransomware attacks. More than half of all ransomware victims have been contacted multiple times with threats and demands for payment. And importantly, over 40% of small to medium business owners had paid in response to one of these previous messages, a significantly higher proportion than other victims. So this fuels the ransomware business model and can increase the likelihood that small to medium business owners are repeatedly victimised. Business owners also experience far-reaching impacts on their devices, so they had a higher number of devices being affected and a larger range of devices being impacted. They're also more likely to say that the ransomware attack impacted devices they used for work or had spread to work systems and email accounts. So taken together, these findings reflect the variety of devices and systems that small to medium business owners now use for personal and work-related tasks. More than half of Australian businesses have adopted cloud technology, and 1 in 3 receive orders via online platforms. During COVID-19, working from home and employees using their own devices for work-related tasks became quite common. So this does introduce security risks, as when employees are using their own devices, they may not update the software and may not follow sort of company security rules or policies. We found that during a ransomware attack, victims expressed fear and panic in response to receiving the message, but ultimately they acted in a quite rational way. So they gathered evidence and sought second opinions, and they tried to find alternatives rather than paying. They found technical solutions, sought outside help and advice, and they occasionally tried to negotiate a reduced payment. So the most important step was restoring their systems and data, and automatic backups were frequently mentioned. So this is consistent with our previous research, finding that having backups is one of the most common reasons that ransomware victims give for not paying. So distrust in the attackers was commonly cited as a reason that victims didn't communicate with the offenders, didn't try and negotiate with them, and decided not to pay the ransom. And encouragingly, most victims decided not to pay the ransom in the most recent incident. So in line with government advice, victims knew that paying doesn't guarantee their access back to their systems and data, and furthermore, paying can put themselves at risk of becoming a victim again. Social support and publicly available information were important in shaping their ability to assess the threat, find practical solutions, and deciding on whether to pay the ransom. Some victims still didn't seek help because they didn't know who could assist, they felt responsible for the attack, or they believed the incident was not serious enough. So there's an ongoing need to raise awareness of the different sort of government, law enforcement and non-government agencies that can offer non-judgmental assistance to victims during and after attacks. Cool. So the data for this presentation is summarised in 2 papers, which we'll be publishing soon. And we also have our Cybercrime in Australia report, which will come out at some point in the next couple of months, which looks at trends for cybercrime for victimisation, help seeking and harms. That's it.